Welcome to the first part of our new series on building out a production-ready API for an MCP server. In this video, I'm going to take an API that I've created for my link shortening service, Minilinks, and get it up and running using the Zuplo API Gateway. Then I'm going to reconfigure my MCP server so that it can use the new gateway-powered API, and I'll show you how quickly you can go from local development to gateway-powered API and MCP combos. This video is the first in a 4-part series, so make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next 3 parts, where we're going to cover API key management and authentication, rate limiting, user plans and metering, and of course deploying our MCP server to Cloudflare. Let's jump into some code and I'll show you what I built. So over in the editor, I've got 2 files. I have an index.js, which is the main Node.js application for the Minilinks API, and index.ts, which is the code for their MCP server. I'm going to show you the application first. It's very simple. It's just a single file that holds an API for Minilinks, which has got a few different endpoints, a health check endpoint just so I can see if it's up and running and it's connecting to the database correctly. It's using Hono as the framework because I'm using Cloudflare. It makes it a little bit easier to work with that particular infrastructure, including the D1 database that we're using as the database for this particular application, the Minilinks API. So if we jump over here into index.ts, this is the MCP server that I created for this application. And again, it's based off of a very standard MCP template. I'm not going to go through how you actually build an MCP server in this video. There's plenty of resources that are available out there. You can go to modelcontactprotocol.io and see a whole bunch of great examples there for Python, for TypeScript. Even a really good example of how you can go through this process and actually build your own MCP server using an LLM with documentation that works very well with LLMs. Love to see that. So in here, we just have a few things that are specific to an MCP server. We've got a request handler, which is basically the handler that's going to make the requests out to the Minilinks API each time one of those needs to be requested. And then a definition over here for that particular MCP server, what it's called and what version it is. And then, of course, the key to any MCP server is the tools that it can use. And I've created 4 tools in here that work with the Minilinks API that will be exposed to any service that can consume this. So whether it's Claude, whether it's Cursor, whether it's any other application that works with MCP, it's going to be able to access these 4 tools. So you can see here that I have a create user tool, which creates users, and there's a create link tool, which creates a link, and there's also a get user links tool, which gets links that are related to a specific user. Let's take a look at the create link tool as an example. You can see that effectively all of this does is it's making requests over to this links endpoint, which exists inside of the Minilinks API. So it's defining the format of the information that needs to get gathered. You can see this here, and the different parameters that need to be passed to the API. It will ensure that the inputs that I provide as a user are actually given over and can go to the API so that that request can be formatted correctly and I can get the response that I'm looking for. Jumping back into the index.js, one of the final things that I can show you here is that this is running locally at the moment, and in order to get this up and running, I'm going to use Wrangler, which is Cloudflare's CLI for working with their tools, and I can just get this up and running using Wrangler dev, which is going to get it spun up on localhost port 8787, which right now is the default that I have for this API base URL inside of the MCP server. So unless another API URL is specified here, it's going to default to looking for the API over on this particular URL, localhost 8787. So that's where it's running. So let's jump over to Claude and I can show you how this works. This is the Claude desktop application, which is the application that you can use to work with MCP servers. Obviously, they work with other tools as well, but for this example, I'm going to use Claude. And you can see here that I have 4 tools available to me. And those are the tools that I defined in the MCP server that I just showed you in that index.ts file. We've got the create link, create user, get link, and get user links tools that are available. And what I can do is just quickly show you the settings here in developer. You see we have the Minilinks application which is up and running, and effectively what this is just doing is it's running Node against this particular argument, which is the absolute path for the built version of that index.ts file. So it's been built from TypeScript through to a JavaScript application, and it's being run with Node. And every time Claude is opened, it will set up that server and start it running in the background so that you can access the Minilinks application. So if we go to how can I help you today, and I say let's shorten some links, it says that it'll be happy to do it. It's going to use Minilinks as the service because it knows it can do this based on the context of the tools that it has available. I don't have an account right now, so let's create one. And for this, I need to provide a username. So let's say that's Martin3434. Email address is martin3434@zuplo.com. And we're going to use passwords here for the moment, but in later videos, we're going to replace this so that we have a more secure way of approaching this. Now, this application is very basic. I've developed it locally. The whole point of this series is to take it from a locally developed application to make it much more production ready. So one of the things we're going to add in a future video is going to be API key authentication and generation from within this. So we're going to be able to do that. But in its basic form right now, we have just basic auth effectively, and we need a password for that. So we're going to use the super secure password that I've provided there. And we're going to set this up. First of all, it needs you to allow this. It's making requests effectively out to a different API. So you need to say as a human that you want that to happen. And the account's being created. So now I have got an account. I have an ID for that account, which means I can now go ahead and start actually shortening links. So let's shorten a bunch of them. We'll do more than one in this request, just so you can see how it can take a bunch of different inputs and start to work with it after the fact. You don't have to do this all like one at a time. That's not necessary. And that's the whole point of working with a chat-based interface like this, is that you can actually ask quite a lot of it, and it's going to use those tools that it has access to figure out how to do all the work that you need. So let's shorten 3 different links. We'll do, first of all, zuplo.com/docs. We'll do zuplo.com/examples, and we'll do zuplo.com/pricing. And for this one, what I want to do is specify a custom slug. So the first 2 will get generated slugs, so just whatever, like a random string of letters and numbers. This one I want to have a very specific one assigned to it, so I can do that using the slug price-me. So now it's going to go away and it's going to check to see if it has a tool to do that. I'll say allow, and it will go and create those shortened links one after the other. And at the end of it, we're going to get a different selection of URLs that have been shortened using my fake link shortening URL. This costs an enormous amount of money, so I couldn't actually buy it just for the purposes of this demo, but in the real world you would have a short link for your short link service. So you can see it's created the 3 that I asked it to. The first 2 have been given just randomly generated short link strings, and this one here is one that I specified I wanted a custom slug for. So they've been created, and those are now assigned to the account that I've also just created. So show me my links is one of the final things. It goes and grabs all of the links that are associated with my account. So if I had more than this that I'd created, then it would go over and get every single one of them and show me those. It's used 2 tools to achieve this. It's gone away and it's got the links, but it's also checked each individual link for a bunch of additional information, like the number of clicks that it's had, which is something that we record through the API. So there you go. That's the whole thing. It's very simplistic, but that's the API that we've built, and that's the MCP server that we have running to connect to that API. Now, the next thing I want to do is start moving this from local, which is what's happening right now. The API is running locally, the MCP server is running locally, everything is on my machine. In order to start to productionize this a little bit more, I want to move the application that I've built over to Cloudflare, and then I'm going to put the Zuplo API Gateway in front of that Cloudflare hosted version. And then we're going to change the config of this so that it's talking to the API Gateway and then to my application, and routing the requests directly through that. Over here in Cloudflare, I've got my application set up and ready to go, and it's running as a Cloudflare worker using a D1 database for the storage. Now, this could just as easily have been deployed to Vercel or Heroku or Fly.io or any of the other services out there that you can use for hosting applications, but I'm using Cloudflare because I'd already been building with that tooling using Wrangler on my local machine, so it made sense to move it to the Cloudflare ecosystem. But also I'm using Zuplo as well, which is backed by Cloudflare's Edge network too, so it's going to keep everything nice and tight inside of that same infrastructure. Now, all good here. The next thing I need is this URL, which is where the application actually lives at this particular moment in time. So if I copy that, I'm just going to show you that this is actually up and running. If I run my little health endpoint here, you can see that the application is showing healthy. This is the exact timestamp of when I'm recording this video, and the database is connected. So I know that I'm good and I'm up and running. The next thing I need to do is head over to Zuplo and start building out the project that's going to be the API gateway for the Minilinks API. So in Zuplo, I'm going to get set up with a new project for the Minilinks API. I'm just using the free tier for this, which does allow up to 1 million requests a month. So it's plenty for what I want to use it for the moment. And obviously, you know, if my app takes off and loads of people are using it and I'm doing much more than that, then I can upgrade it really quickly to the next tier, and I won't have any problems with the amount of requests that people are doing. So let's give this a name. It's Minilinks. So we'll do Minilinks API, and I'm going to start this off just as an empty project. Okay, so our project's ready, and this is the URL that the API is going to live at for the time being. This is the dev URL. Obviously, when I go down the route of taking this all the way through to production, I'll be able to add a custom domain to this so that we're not using this particular API to this particular endpoint, to hit the API. Let's go through to the code and get things set up for Minilinks. So the first thing we need to do now that we have this project in place is actually set up some routes for the application that we have. Now, just as a reminder, if we go back over to Cursor and look in here, we actually have a whole bunch of different endpoints that we need to have set up, right? For our health, for our users, for link creation. There's all of these endpoints that exist here right now, but we need to recreate those in the gateway so that when the requests come from the MCP server, they're going to get passed through to this application and we're not going to get any 404 errors. So jumping back to Zuplo, we head over to routes.oas.json, and there are two different approaches that I can take here. I could add each of the routes that I want just by clicking on add route and saying, okay, this new route is for create users, and I can do this as users, set it to post, and then start adding my policies and handlers here. But that's going to take some time as I create all of the different endpoints that I need. There is a quicker way to do this, and that is to use the OpenAPI document that I used to create my API initially. So that was the definition of all of those different endpoints, and what I can do is import that into here and have it set up all of those routes without me having to go through and individually set them all up with all of the different post and get and delete and update HTTP verbs. So I can just click on Open API and I can bring that over. So if I go into Cursor real quick, I have a copy of the Open API right here. This was created initially using Mistral as part of another series that we do on the channel where we see which LLMs can create the best Open API documents using the description for the Minilinks API. And this one was created using Mistral, and a zero-shot prompt in Mistral's latest model managed to get a 96 score on Rate My Open API for this. So it's a really very good Open API document. So if I go and get this in Finder and head back here, we will drag and drop this onto Zuplo. And you can see here it's gone through, looked at the document, and I've got the definitions for all of my different endpoints. So if I complete that import, it's going to bring everything into here, and you can see now we're all set up. I haven't had to go through and create all of these individually, which is awesome. So the next step for this is going to be that I need to set up where all of these are going to go to. So for instance, when the MCP server makes a request to our gateway API, which is this, for the /users endpoint, I need to tell it where that's going to go, right? Which is our new application that we've deployed to Cloudflare. So you can see based off of the document that it has decided that the endpoint for our application is currently api.minilinks.com/v1, which would be awesome, but that's not where it lives at this moment in time. So we know that it exists over here. We have this, our Cloudflare deployed version. So what I can do is go and make the changes here so that when a request comes into /users, it will be forwarded on to this particular URL right here, and it will append /users on to the end of that, and we'll get to the API that's based on Cloudflare, which is cool. I don't want to go through and make all of these changes to each one of these here either. So what I can do is actually open up the routes.os.json, which is the basis, the open API basis for this particular project. And I can actually make that change right here. In line 17, where the servers are defined, I can change this so that what we have is it pointing to this particular API, right? So that's all done. If I click on save, it's going to rebuild the project and it's going to deploy it out to the edge like super quickly. 5.2 seconds it took to get that out there. And now if we go back to our routes, you can see that we have got all of these routes now forwarding to the correct URL. So anytime any requests come in here, they're going to get forwarded onto our Cloudflare hosted application, which is awesome. So we'll save that. That will redeploy the whole project. And I guess one of the things that we can do here is let's test it. So what we could do is actually use the health check endpoint to check this really quickly. Now that's not in the Open API specification that I imported here because I added it after the fact. But what I can do is actually just add that really quickly here. So let's check health, and we'll do health. It's a GET request, and we will forward that on to here, save the project. So now I'm going to pass this through directly to the Cloudflare hosted version of the API, but using the gateway to process that request. So if I grab this URL and we'll check it here, that's the Cloudflare version. So then if we replace this with our Zuplo URL this time and run it, we're getting exactly the same thing. Run it a few more times just so you can see that this is updating. So that's passing everything through perfectly over to Cloudflare exactly as we would need it to do, which means that now the Minilinks API is up and running inside of the Zuplo API Gateway, and we can start to make changes to our MCP server now to route all of the requests directly through Zuplo instead of directly at the Cloudflare hosted version, which doesn't have security or rate limiting or anything else in place, because we're going to do that with Zuplo in some later videos. So here's how we're going to get from the current state of our MCP server, which is talking to the local version of the Minilinks API on my machine running on localhost port 8787, to a version of it that's going to use the new hosted version with the Zuplo API Gateway in front of it. And it's real easy to make this change. So you can see here on line 9, currently what we do is we default to localhost 8787 if there isn't an API URL specified in the MCP server configuration. So that's what we're going to need to go and change. I'm going to make this change in Claude, and because all we need to do is change a setting in the configuration for this MCP server. So let's open this up inside a cursor. And you can see here, this is the basic setup we have. This is what runs when Claude loads to get this particular MCP server up and running. And what we have is the option to pass an environment variable called api.url. So let's do that. And you do this by adding an env to this. And Cursor's completed it sort of right, but not entirely. We're not using API keys at this particular moment in time, although we will in the future. So our API URL is the environment variable that we want, but this is not the correct one. So if we head back over to our browser inside of the Minilinks project, we can grab that from there. And this is now the URL for our application. So if we save this and close this down, then we should be good to go. What we need to do though, first of all, is in order to have this change take effect, we're going to have to quit out of Claude, and then we are going to open it up once again, and it will take effect now because it's going to spin up the server one more time. So we can see that there are still 4 tools available to us, and now we're going to say, hey, let's shorten some links. 2 exclamation marks for this. Super excited. Okay, so it's a new session, don't have an account. Let's create a new one, because now we're going to go through a different URL for this. We're going through the gateway, which is pointing at Cloudflare, which is pointing at a database, a D1 database inside of Cloudflare, which doesn't have the user that I created last time, because all of that was created locally. So let's create the new user. It's going to go create that account. We're going to have to allow this because it's not run this before. And now it's done it. But this time, rather than doing this on my local machine, that has passed that request all the way through the Zuplo API Gateway, where it's been handled and forwarded to the Cloudflare hosted version of the application, the Minilinks API. So my account's all set up. Let's create some new short links. We'll do same ones that we did before because they don't exist on this. So docs, and actually just to differentiate this a little bit from the last time, let's make this one with the custom slug P for the win. So now it's going to go and it's going to make that request to execute that and create these short links for us. This time it's going to be happening through the gateway over to Cloudflare and getting those responses back. So that worked. That's all done exactly as I would expect it to. I've got the short links and I have the one with the slug, but all of this was done via the gateway this time and not on my local machine. So let's jump back over to our project inside of Zuplo and we can actually take a look at the analytics. Just to show you, you can see that those requests all came through and these are the ones that were made. We just did these, looking at response time and the request by status, everything that we would need to understand how well that this is working, what the top routes were in that particular period of time. So we used health, we used links, we used users, everything is up and running as we would expect it to be working, which is awesome. And now we're set up inside of Zuplo. So we can start from here now, really building out more of the production aspects of our application. So now we're at a stage where our MCP server is talking to our gateway, which is passing requests through to our hosted version of the Minilinks API on Cloudflare, which is awesome. But we are now missing a couple of things that are super important. We don't really have any authentication on this API, so we're going to need to add that. We haven't got rate limiting on here, so we're going to need to add that. And there's a whole other things that make an app more production ready, such as metering, monetization, and ultimately getting that MCP server hosted somewhere so it isn't on my local machine either and other people can also use it. We're going to cover all of those topics in future videos that are coming up really, really soon. This is a 4-part series. You've just watched part 1. Thank you very much for doing so. To make sure you catch the next 3, subscribe to the channel and I will see you soon.